to call some attention to the title of my talk today, Sailing to Freedom, Uncovering and Recentering Maritime Dimensions of the Underground Railroad. So I think we all know that when we think about the Underground Railroad in the United States, we mostly think about it as a land-bound terrestrial historical process of people escaping over land. And there's not a whole lot about people escaping by water in the scholarly literature or in the way that it's taught in the pedagogical materials that are provided to teachers in United States schools. But what I'd like to do is, and in the interest of full disclosure, I want to change the way that you think about the Underground Railroad. I want you to think about it as something that happened very frequently on water. And in fact, if you were escaping from the far south, the very deep south, the best way, and many times the only way that you could achieve a life of freedom from and leave a life of enslavement behind was to do so by water. So, so I want to recenter that story as a major part of the entire Underground Railroad story. But I also want to talk about how we know about this. So, as historians often do, we start with a map, and this is a map from the National Geographic Society. It sort of encapsulates the way the Underground Railroad is often taught in the United States. And you'll notice that there is, in fact, a nod to people escaping northward along the East Coast. The arrows show that. But most of the story, at least the way it's dealt with in US classrooms, shows the terrestrial side. And so I want to look, if we understand this map, it is asking us to understand the Underground Railroad as starting very, very far in the deep south from central Alabama and central Mississippi and central Georgia and through the western Carolinas and up from eastern Tennessee and central Tennessee. And the problem with this map, I want to push back a little bit because the real problem with the way this map uh, expresses the Underground Railroad or conveys it is that the historical record does not back up the idea that people are escaping overland from the very deep South. In fact, if we look at the historical evidence and if we look at people escaping overland, better than 95%, probably closer to 98% of them, successful escapes overland on the Underground Railroad, they all began within just a few days' walk of the border with a free northern state. And so we have a lot of evidence of people escaping from eastern Missouri or northern Kentucky or what is today West Virginia or Maryland or Delaware, but very, very, very few people successfully escaping from the deep South. And the reason for that is that overland escape through what was essentially hostile territory, with people constantly, vigilantly looking out for African Americans who were traveling without permission and who appeared to be escaping. It was just very difficult for people to get from very far in the deep South, traveling hundreds of miles by foot. It just didn't happen. And so we need to kind of rethink the way we think about the terrestrial Underground Railroad in that way. And if we think about some of the challenges that faced people trying to find their way to freedom over land, we can think about simple things like simply speed. Traveling over land was very slow, especially if you're traveling by foot. You might be able to make 10 or 15 miles in a night. And remember, people are traveling mainly at night to remain out of sight and unnoticed. If they were fortunate enough to have a large draft animal like a horse, they might be able to travel a bit faster, 25 to 30 miles a night. But nevertheless, it's still relatively slow. And by the way, just as an aside, we often see art of the Underground Railroad that shows people carrying lanterns. If you want to get caught at night, you carry a light. And so, quite frequently, I think that there are misrepresented representations by modern artists who don't think about the practical danger that would have been added to a fugitive if they carried a lantern at night. But anyway, so the point here is that people traveling overland had all kinds of challenges, and one of them was moving slowly through territory that they probably didn't know, where they didn't have friends or family, that they didn't know the geography, that they were finding their way by following the stars, and that they wouldn't have had any sort of infrastructure to help them. And so they're trying to remain out of sight. They're trying to remain clandestine, and they would have had to feed themselves and sort of keep themselves safe traveling overland through a territory in which people were constantly trying to stop them. So, on that note, this idea of runaway slave patrols, which were found throughout the South, there was a very active infrastructure in place, put in place by the slave-owning class of Southerners to keep enslaved people on task, on their jobs, and in the places where they were owned as human property. And so we have patrols set up throughout the South that were designed to interdict people trying to escape and bring them back to the people who owned them. Furthermore, people who were enslaved had to travel, if they were traveling, they had to be able to demonstrate that they were traveling legitimately with permission to do so. And so you have throughout the South, people who were enslaved had identification. Sometimes they had to wear a tag. Sometimes they had to carry a written permission note. And if they didn't have these things that would have been issued to them specifically for purposes of their work, then they would have been liable to being arrested, being brought back to the folks who owned them, and re-enslaved. So escape was very, very difficult overland, where there were constantly opportunities to be identified, to be stopped, to be challenged, and to be re-enslaved. Now, these slave patrols were there so that they could stop and challenge people and check whether or not they had legitimate access or permission to travel. And they did carry lanterns so they could check slavery permission notes for travel. And we have a lot of those, by the way, archived. Slave passes that typically were something very simple, handwritten by a known owner of enslaved people, and they were dated and they were very carefully checked by the slave patrols. But all of these measures were in place to keep people from running away and to stop them escaping over land. Furthermore, the slave patrols had trained dogs that were especially trained to be able to pursue people who were enslaved. And we have lots of stories of the various measures and the violence of the measures taken to keep people in a state of enslavement. If we contrast that to traveling by water, you can understand that traveling by water was a lot easier, a lot more efficient, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. This is a map of the Underground Railroad published right at the end of the 19th century in 1898 by an historian from Ohio who tracked and through correspondence and through personal interviews, he spoke to people who had either been operatives of the Underground Railroad or who had escaped. And so he's able to map in this map from 1898 from personal interaction with agents or fugitives on the Underground Railroad where they were going. And his map pretty much shows that most of the Underground Railroad operated in the North after people had crossed into a free state. Now, I was born in Detroit, Michigan, and I grew up part of my life around there. And Detroit was a very important crossover point into Canada for people who had escaped. But I also grew up just outside of Dayton, Ohio, in Southwest Ohio. And I grew up thinking about the Underground Railroad entirely as a land-based phenomenon. But the thing to notice on this map is that the one exception to where the Underground Railroad and Underground Railroad operatives operated in the South was in seaports. So we've got people operating in Portsmouth and Norfolk, Virginia, in Charleston, South Carolina, and other Carolina ports. And also, this isn't in the South, but in Philadelphia and moving up the Delaware Bay, you have operatives of the Underground Railroad there. And so this seaborne side was understood by people who had lived through the Underground Railroad period and understood that it was happening. But in the 20th century, it sort of fell out of our national awareness, our national memory that people were actually escaping by water. Now, I started to think about this seaborne side of the Underground Railroad when I moved to New Bedford, Massachusetts to take up a job at UMass, University of Massachusetts Dartmouth. I engaged with the local community that keeps history alive, public history, including the National Park Service. But there's an organization in New Bedford called the New Bedford Historical Society. Now, New Bedford has two historical societies. One is called the Old Dartmouth Historical Society, which includes our world-class whaling museum, because New Bedford was a center of whaling, as many of you no doubt know. But we also have a historical society called the New Bedford Historical Society, which focuses entirely on the stories of people of color. And that would include not only African Americans, but also Native Americans who lived in our area, Cape Verdeans who came here for the whaling industry, and also South Pacific Islanders who came to New Bedford because of whaling. Now, the director of the New Bedford Historical Society is a wonderful colleague named Lee Blake. And when I first came to town about 20 years ago, I had a conversation with her, and she said, "Did you know that New Bedford was a terminal point, a destination on the Underground Railroad?" And I said, "Well, no, I didn't know that." And so I started to learn about it, and she and I collaborated, and we applied for a National Endowment for the Humanities grant called Landmarks in American History to teach U.S. K through 12 teachers about New Bedford's role as a destination in the Underground Railroad. And so we were fortunate enough to get federal funding to do this. We ran programs in the summers of 2011, 2013, 2015, and it was at that point that we decided we needed to do a book about this. We did it again in 2022, and we're doing it this summer in 2025. Now, we assumed that many people were arriving in New Bedford over land because that's the way you escaped on the Underground Railroad. But as we started to do these programs and we learned more about it and we invited scholarly experts to come and give presentations about the people who arrived in New Bedford, it emerged that, in fact, most of the people coming to New Bedford are arriving not by land, but by water. And so it transpired that we started to really focus on this seaborne side to the Underground Railroad. Now, we built on a number of experts who had done work before us. One of them is Jeffrey Bolster's wonderful book called Blackjacks, African American Seamen in the Age of Sail. And this book comes out in 1998, and it pretty much demonstrates that almost 1/5 of all sailors working on American vessels, American flagged vessels, US flagged vessels, merchant ships, whaling ships, commercial vessels, and military vessels, about 1/5 of the sailors are African American. And some of them are free blacks who are earning wages on their own behalf, but many of them are in fact enslaved mariners, enslaved sailors whose wages go to the people who own them. But Jeff Bolster's book magnificently shows that there were quite a lot of people working on US vessels in the first half of the 19th century and in the late 18th century who were people of African descent. And of course, working on vessels, they have a much more cosmopolitan view of the world. They have a lot more experience. They understand geography. They understood the geography of the East Coast. And they were in the perfect position to not only to inspire, but also to assist people who were enslaved to run away. So another thing to bear in mind is that right up until the end of the 19th century, so much of American commerce up and down the East Coast of the United States is moving by water. There are thousands upon thousands of small vessels working under sail, moving up and down the East Coast constantly, and they employed a very, very large number of sailors. So you have sloops and schooners and brigs and full rig ships moving the cargo of the United States up and down the eastern seaboard. The way to move goods was by water. And that's because we didn't have railroads, we didn't have roads. Many of the big inlets and rivers of the East Coast were not bridged. And so the easiest and most efficient way to move quantities of cargo was by water. And that cloud of shipping moving up and down the East Coast gave an opportunity for African Americans in the South to escape to northern states. Now, the other thing to know is that in the South, south of the Mason-Dixon line, prior to the Civil War, if you went into any harbor or any port area, most of the laborers working on the waterfront and in the harbors were enslaved African Americans. You would have some white workers who might have been overseers or the crews of northern ships who came down and were doing business in these ports, but the overwhelming majority of the labor force in southern harbors and ports and along the waterfront were enslaved African Americans. And in order to understand what they're doing, well, let's look at some of the jobs that they were doing. And in fact, they're doing everything. They're doing the work of waterfront dock and wharf workers. They're loading and unloading ships as longshoremen or stevedores. And that was pretty skilled labor because you had to properly load a ship so that it would be balanced in the water and it would sail properly, that its trim of the vessel was correct. So these guys are skilled workers, longshoremen and stevedores, but they're also enslaved workers are warehousemen. They are drovers and teamsters bringing provisions and cargo to the port. They're working in the warehouses. They are also skilled shipyard workers. So they are doing the rigging of vessels and the sail making. They are doing the caulking on the wooden hulls of vessels to keep them watertight. And because they are working intensively in these southern ports, they understand the rhythms of these harbors. They know, for example, when a ship is getting ready to clear the port and leave. And so they know when a good time would be to get on board if you were trying to escape. They would know when the forces of law enforcement would be present in the port and how to evade people who might be trying to stop them from escaping. The other thing they're doing, they're not only working on the waterfront, on the docks and the wharves as landbound laborers, but they're actually working as watermen on the water. They are essential, skilled watermen. They're fishermen, they're operating ferries, they're working on boats called lighters as lightermen. These are big boats that load and unload ships when a ship is at anchor or on a mooring, so they're not on the dock. And also they are deckhands and pilots who know how to navigate these vessels, and they understand where the nautical hazards are, the shoal waters, the shallow waters of a harbor. They know the currents and the tides, and they understand how these harbors operate. They're also working with a great deal of autonomy. You have African American enslaved captains of fishing boats and oyster boats and ferry boats who have black crews working under them, and they are not working with the supervision of any sort of white owner or overseer. They're doing all this labor by themselves. And so this skilled knowledge of how ports function and how to work on the sea, gives people the skill and the opportunity to escape. We can also look at the concentrations of enslaved African Americans in the South prior to the Civil War. This is from the U.S. Census of 1860. And if you look at where the concentrations of enslaved people are, or the African American population, these darkest counties have 70 to 80% of the population being enslaved people. And so all of the major ports of the South, Charleston, South Carolina, various ports in the Carolinas, North Carolina, the inland waterways of Virginia, and these big rivers, this is where the African American population is concentrated along the coast. And that's also where much of the best plantation land is too, because the heavy agricultural cargoes, the agricultural goods that are being grown in the South, the only way to get them, those heavy bulk agricultural products down to the harbors for export is on river going ships and small boats that is all being done by black laborers, by enslaved African American laborers. So all along the coast, this is where the concentration of African American populations are. And again, this strategic knowledge, working with the sea and working on the water, provides opportunities for escape. If we just look at South Carolina, you can see that right along the coast, there are all of these really high concentrations, 85% around Beaufort, 81%, 65% around Charleston. That's what the percentage of people who are enslaved African Americans are along that region of coastline. We also have politicians who are complaining about people escaping by water out of their ports and harbors and along their waterfronts. So we have James Mason, who's a senator from Virginia in the 1840s. He states on the record that human property worth $100,000 is escaping annually from his state. Meanwhile, in Maryland, the governor, Thomas Pratt, says about $80,000 in human property annually is escaping through the ports of Maryland. So this together, this accounts for hundreds of people every year just from 2 states. And if we included the entire South, we would see that a lot of people are escaping by water. And so I want to think about now, as a historian, how do we gather evidence for the fact that this is happening? We know that politicians and we know that they're saying that this is going on, but how do we prove it as historians? What's the evidence? And I would hasten to say here, just have us pause and think for a second. What we're talking about is activity that is illegal, clandestine, and where it behooves everyone involved to keep this information secret and quiet. And so it's very hard for historians to find a paper trail for individual acts of escape. Sometimes it happens that years after someone has successfully escaped by water, they might write down an account of their story, and we're happy to get those. And in fact, of the roughly 105 or so known what are called slave escape narratives, 70% of known slave escape narratives mention escape by water. So that's a very high percentage. And I would like to press on by showing you some of the other kinds of evidence that we have to know that this is going on. The evidence will fall into several categories. One category is what is called runaway slave ads, advertisements placed in newspapers. We'll also look at laws and ordinances passed by Southern municipalities and by Southern states to try to stop people from escaping by water. We will look at runaway slave narratives, and we'll also look at the accounts published by abolitionists in the North who talk about this activity. Many of those abolitionists, of course, are operatives on the Underground Railroad. So let's start with runaway slave ads. There are about 220,000 individual runaway slave ads in newspapers in the United States, published from about the first quarter of the 18th century, so the 1730s or so, right up until the end of the Civil War in 1865. 220,000 individual runaway slave ads. Here's one. This is from the Virginia Gazette in Williamsburg, 17th of December, 1772. So it's prior to independence. And this is a guy, so a runaway slave ad is placed typically by the owner or by the owner's agent, and it usually includes certain kinds of information. It'll say the name of the person who has escaped. It will give a physical description of that person and talk a little bit about their qualities, and if they speak a different language or something about them, physical identifiers. But it usually will also give, besides a reward, it'll give an indication of how the owner thinks that their human property has run away. What methods did they use? And of course, the objective here is to get the person back, because these were valuable human beings who had been purchased for a very high price, and the owners want them back. So this is a guy named Phil. He's about 20 years old. He's 5'9", and he has experience as a sailor. So the part that I have highlighted, as he has been used to the sea, he will probably endeavor to get on board some ship and make his escape out of the colony. All masters of vessels are therefore forewarned from harboring or carrying him off at their peril. So not only do we have the owner saying, I think he got away on a vessel, but if you are a owner or a master of a vessel, I will warn you not to help him out, because this is against the law. We have so many of these. When we started looking for runaway slave ads, we first started finding, dozens of them, then scores, and then hundreds. And we know that there are thousands and thousands of these that mention escape by water. Here's another one from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The American Daily Advertiser, $10 reward, absconded from the household of the President of the United States on Saturday afternoon. Only judge, a light mulatto girl. Now, of course, the President of the United States in 1796 was George Washington. Philadelphia was the nation's capital. And even though Pennsylvania was a free state by 1796, there was a grandfather clause that allowed slave owners to bring servants with them into Pennsylvania for a period of up to 6 months. And Oni Judge thought that she knew that she was about to be rotated back to Mount Vernon because her 6-month period was almost up. And she was also worried that she was going to be sold to someone that she didn't particularly want to work for. And so the advertisement here, which is placed by Washington's agent, as she may attempt to escape by water, all masters of vessels and others are cautioned against receiving her on board. In fact, she did escape by water. She got on a vessel in the port of Philadelphia, comes down through Delaware Bay and up the East Coast, and she ends up in New Hampshire, where she spends the rest of her life in freedom. And she writes about this later in the 19th century. But Washington, who lived another 3 years, he dies in 1799, he spent the rest of his life trying to get her back. And even as President of the United States, he did not have the power to override laws in New Hampshire that protected Oni Judge as a now free woman living in a state that did not recognize the legality of enslavement. So moving ahead chronologically, this is a broadside, a kind of a poster that was put up in Baltimore in 1810. It's about a guy named Jack, again, 5'8" or 9, and he has some experience with water. His object is to go to sea and will be trying to ship on board some vessel bound out. Note below, all masters of vessels and others are forewarned harboring or taking off said Negro at their peril. And so increasingly, we have laws that are put into place to prosecute masters of ships, crew members, owners of vessels, if they are implicated in an escape. Many of us are familiar with the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, but in fact, Congress passed an earlier Fugitive Slave Act in 1793 that didn't have quite the teeth that the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act had, but it did say that if you knowingly helped someone to escape, you were liable to prosecution. And for a ship's owner or ship's master, that could mean having one's cargo confiscated, one's vessel confiscated, being prosecuted and possibly serving jail time or prison time. It was a big deal to be caught helping someone to escape. The law did not fall evenly on members of society, though. If you were an enslaved person and you were caught helping someone to escape, it could mean that you would be sold uh, to the far south to work on in the backbreaking work of and often lethal work of a plantation. If you were a free black person in the South, it could be a capital offense to help someone to escape. So the law did not fall evenly on you. It depended on your status as a free or an enslaved person about how you would be prosecuted for helping someone to escape from enslavement. Here's another one, 1838, from the Wilmington Advertiser of North Carolina. And this is targeting the crews that were suspected of helping someone to escape. This is well, the highlighted part, as very little doubt can be entertained of his conveyance away on board some vessel, I will give the further reward of $500 for the conviction and punishment agreeable to law of the master or captain, and half that sum for the conviction of any member of the crew or other person engaged in this felonious act. So increasingly, we're seeing the targeting of ships that were helping people to escape in the South, because they knew the Southern owner class knew that this was happening. They knew that their ports were a virtual sieve of people fleeing annually, and they were losing enormous amounts of property. Not only are they losing financial interests, the value of the enslaved people who are escaping, but it's also a brain drain, because often some of the people who are getting away are very highly trained, very highly skilled port workers who know how to keep the Southern economy rolling. It was maritime energy and maritime efforts that kept the economy of the South functioning. And this was largely in the hands of the enslaved population working in the ports. So it's a financial drain, it's also a brain drain. This is looking at African Americans who are fishermen and boatmen in the South, and they were seen as potentially helping enslaved people to escape as well. So here we have Mary and William who are escaping, and both of them have had for a long time relations with the Negro fishermen in the bayou. And so the suspicion is that the fishermen have helped them to escape. And this is in the 1840s, I think. Now, this is not a runaway slave ad. I include it because it gives us some insight from the perspective of ship's captains. Now, that 1793 Fugitive Slave Act, again, gave a kind of a loophole. If you could demonstrate that you were not knowingly or deliberately helping someone to escape, then you were not liable. You were protected from prosecution. So this is a public notice placed by a sea captain from the New Bedford area. This is in a New Bedford newspaper, the Medley or Marine Journal from 1797. And it's a public notice where the ship's captain is trying to establish a kind of legal defense for the fact that he was implicated and involved in an escape. So let's look at this and try to read between the lines and decide if we believe the captain when he tells us that he was the unwitting helper in this escape attempt. So, public notice, to all whom it may concern, know ye that I, William Tabor, commander of the sloop Union, sailed from the York River in Virginia on or about the 28th of March last, bound to this port, New Bedford, that on the day after sailing, I discovered a Negro on board said sloop who had concealed himself unbeknownst to me. What he's saying is, I had nothing to do with this. This guy just turned up on my ship. He was not there with my consent, but there he was. And then it gets a little more interesting. He says, it appearing inconsistent for me to return, the wind being ahead, I proceeded on my voyage and landed him at this port, New Bedford. So what he's saying is, look, I'm on a sailboat. I don't have an engine. I may have wanted to turn the ship around and take this legal property back to his legal owner, but I couldn't because I'm in the Gulf Stream, the wind is behind me, and I have to proceed on my voyage. That's what he's saying. And of course, no one is in a position to challenge the captain's word. The captain's word is law at sea. So So this man calls his name James. He's about 27 years old. He says he belongs to Mr. Shackelford, a planter in Kings and Queens County, Virginia. Any person claiming him will know by this information where he is, for which purpose it is made public in this manner, and every legal method has been taken to prevent the owner losing the property in my power. William Tabor, New Bedford, April 20th, 1797. So this was a weekly newspaper. Once it's published, it is likely that Mr. Shackelford eventually would learn about this because newspapers circulated up and down the East Coast. But by the time the owner finds out where his enslaved human property might be, James could be anywhere. He could be in Canada. He could be in upstate New York. We don't know. So by publishing this public notice, this legal notice, the captain is, on one hand, erecting a legal defense to himself so that he and his crew and his vessel cannot be prosecuted, but he's also not harming the chances of James to get away. And so the question that we have is, do we believe William Tabor when he says, I had nothing to do with this? Or was he, in effect, actually helping, or members of his crew might have been helping enslaved people to escape, but evading prosecution by simply saying, we did not intentionally do this? That's an interesting question for historians. Well, you might also be asking, was there any way for the US government to interdict people escaping by water on ships? Could they stop and search vessels at sea? It's an interesting question. There was a government agency that could do this, the Revenue Service, the forerunner of the Coast Guard. There were ships that were patrolling, looking for smugglers and looking for illegal activity at sea in the 19th and late 18th century. But we have to remember that at the time, and right up until the end of the 19th century, coastal national waters only extended out 3 miles. So territorial water was 3 miles out, after which point you're in international water. So within an hour or so after sailing, many ships would be in international waters, and they would travel outside the place of jurisdiction of the Revenue Service for most of the voyage up the East Coast. So once they're offshore 3 miles in the Gulf Stream and heading up the coast, there's no one who can stop them from and search them legally to look for enslaved people. So the point here is that traveling by water, and any of these people working in the ports of the South would have known this very well. Once you're aboard a vessel, with or without the permission of the crew of a ship bound to the north, all you have to do is go along for the ride. A ship traveling up the coast with good weather and in the Gulf Stream is going to travel reliably 3, 4, 5 miles an hour, 100 or 120, 130 miles a day easily. It was under very good circumstances, you could travel from Charleston, South Carolina to New York in a matter of 6 or 7 days. And that is so much faster than you can go over land. A ship is going 24 hours a day. It doesn't stop. You don't have to hide. You don't have to avoid or evade being challenged by slave patrols. All you have to do is ride along. And if you're doing this with the knowledge and the cooperation of the crew, then it's a very easy and secure trip. Southern slave owners very quickly realized that they had a problem and that they were losing enormous numbers of people every year. And they blamed free black sailors working on ships doing business in the South with encouraging their human property to run away. A colleague of mine, Michael Schopner in Maine, has written a book called Moral Contagion, in which he talks about the kinds of laws erected by Southern municipalities and states to begin to control the movements of free black sailors working on ships. And essentially what happens, beginning in 1822 in Charleston, South Carolina, and then the entire state of South Carolina, and then the other southern states follow suit shortly thereafter. They start to erect laws that restrict the movements of African American sailors when they come into southern ports. What they require African American sailors to do is either remain on the vessel the entire time that it's in port, and that could be a matter of weeks, or eventually they were incarcerating free black sailors, keeping them in jail in southern ports for the duration of the time that their ship was in harbor. And they would only be released at the time when the ship was leaving. Now, the costs of their incarceration were borne by the vessel that employed them. And so the captains had to pay for the food and the lodging in the jails of the South, which of course is a huge disincentive to hire free black sailors. And that's what the Southern owner class wanted to have happen. They wanted to stop any opportunity of free blacks to interact with people who were enslaved, because the Southern owner class was absolutely certain, probably with some justification, that free blacks were encouraging their human property to run away. The other thing that the southern states and ports started to do was to create examination stations and fumigation stations for ships that were clearing their harbors to go north. So they would systematically search below deck for stowaways, and they would fumigate vessels, burning things like sulfur and brimstone below deck in an effort to create these noxious fumes that would drive out anyone who was hidden in the cargo below decks. And so this also happens, and we have laws, we have the records of laws creating these requirements for northbound ships to go through this before they leave harbor. So there's a fumigation. These are images from the British Navy, but this is the best that I could get talking about fumigation. Another form of evidence we have is runaway slave narratives, and I'll give you a few examples. This is Thomas Jones, who was a longshoreman in Wilmington, North Carolina for many years. And in 1849, he stowed away aboard a brig bound for New York, a brig called the Belle. The captain genuinely did not know that he was aboard, and when he found out, the captain was very worried about being prosecuted. And so when they got to New York, he anchored the ship about 2 miles off, and he went ashore to find a federal marshal to turn Thomas Jones over to federal authorities so that he wouldn't be prosecuted, the captain. Jones, who had the free run of the ship because nobody thought that he would try to get ashore, being anchored 2 miles out, he threw together a raft, probably a raft that did not look nearly as nice as the illustration here, and he tries to make a break for it and get to shore. The ship's first mate and several of the crew go after him, but he very providentially is spotted by 2 other northern sailors who were abolitionists in their outlook. They got him into their boat, they got him to shore, they got him into a safe house in the Underground Railroad, and eventually he makes his way to New Bedford, Massachusetts, where I am right now, and then to Boston. In 1862, right after the Civil War begins, he publishes his account, The Experience of Thomas Jones, who was a slave for 43 years. And in that, this is where the illustration comes from, he tells the story of his escape by water. Another extraordinary story is this, Harriet Jacobs, who in 1842, after enduring 7 years living in essentially a crawl space in a house, her grandmother's house in Edenton, North Carolina, she finally finds a way to get aboard a ship, and she escapes northward. In 1860, right on the eve of the Civil War, she publishes her memoir called Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, in which she puts the highlight on the risks and the dangers of being a female enslaved young woman in the South. In very guarded Victorian language, she conveys the abuses that were leveled upon her by several people who were in a position of authority over her. So this book makes a sensation when it's published in the North. Her brother, similarly, escapes by water. This is him. His name is John Jacobs. He's the brother of Harriet Jacobs. And he escaped to New Bedford from Edenton, North Carolina. He immediately signed on to a whaling voyage. Now, if you're an African American man and you're a fugitive from enslavement, one of the things that you could do to avoid being recaptured and taken back into slavery was to sign on as a sailor on a whaling voyage and be on the other side of the world for 2 to 3 years. So that's exactly what he does. Then he becomes a merchant sailor. He travels the world. And in 1855, he is actually uh, he's in Australia and he's working as a miner for opals, taking a little break from the sea. And he decides that he wants to publish an essay, an account of being an enslaved person in the United States. So he walks into a newspaper office in Sydney, Australia, and he gives a manuscript that this Australian newspaper published. And it is an absolute scathing account of his life as an enslaved person in the United States. And this account has just been rediscovered in the last couple of years by a colleague of ours here in Rhode Island named Jonathan Schroeder. The book was published by Chicago University Press last May in 2024. The book is called, and John Jacobs' title of his account is The United States Governed by 600,000 Despots, which is a reference to the number of Americans who held human property in the period prior to the Civil War. So Jacobs he becomes literate. He learns how to read and write while he's a whaler. Has himself painted in about 1848, and he's holding a copy of The Liberator, Garrison's anti-slavery abolitionist newspaper published in Boston. And this painting, which is held by the African American Museum of Philadelphia, was only identified just a couple of years ago, and we were able to use it in an exhibition about the Maritime Underground Railroad, which was at the New Bedford Whaling Museum. Another person with a New Bedford connection is this Daniel Drayton, who was a sea captain and commanded a schooner called the Pearl. The Pearl incident was an incident in 1848 in which 77 people were attempting to escape from the waterfront of Washington, D.C. And many of those people were the property of some of the most powerful people in the United States government until 1850 or so. Slave trading happened openly in the streets of Washington, D.C., and much of the labor in the city was done by enslaved people. Daniel Drayton, Captain Drayton, wrote a memoir called A Personal Memoir of Daniel Drayton in 1855, in which he recounted the attempted escape, which, by the way, was not successful. But he has this line: no sooner does a vessel known to be from the north anchor in any of these waters — he was talking about Chesapeake Bay — then she is boarded in hopes of obtaining a passage in her to a land of freedom. And so we see that this was happening all the time, constantly. Captains knew that this was going to happen if they were at anchor. Enslaved African Americans would try to get aboard and try to find their way north to freedom. His schooner, the Pearl, was a kind of rickety old schooner. He was asked by some abolitionists, Daniel Drayton was, to try to get out a family, but word got out, and soon 77 people boarded the schooner in the waterfront at Washington, D.C. They made their way down the Potomac River, but they had an adverse wind, and so they had to drop anchor at the mouth of the river. Meanwhile, the owners noticed that their human property was missing, and so they got a steam-powered vessel and went after the Pearl, and they were captured at the mouth of the Potomac. Drayton went to prison for 4 years. Most of the enslaved people were sold to the Deep South. A few of them were purchased out of slavery, but for the most part, it did not end well for most of these people who tried to escape. This is Elizabeth Blakely. She was 15 years old when she escaped by sea from Wilmington, North Carolina, ended up in Boston in 1850. She was 2 weeks at sea. She was only 15 years old. She endured a very difficult passage in the winter, suffered from frostbite, but she did make it to freedom, and her story wasn't published until the 1920s, when she was still alive, and she publishes an account of her escape. This is an abolitionist. His name is Austin Bierce. He publishes a book in 1880 called Reminiscences of Fugitive Slave Law Days in Boston. He had a yacht, a nice sailboat in Boston called the Moby Dick. And in 1853, just a couple of years after Melville published the book Moby Dick, he named his yacht after that. But he recounts in his book how when ships from the South would come into Boston Harbor, they would send out a woman to sell cakes and pies and things to the sailors, usually an African American woman, who would then inquire discreetly if there were any contraband persons on board. And if the answer was yes, then in the dark of night, they would send the yacht out to take that person off and get them on shore, get them into a safe house, and then get them out of Boston as quickly as they could, because Boston was not a safe city. There were bounty hunters looking for enslaved people who were escaping and trying to capture them and arrest them and bring them back to their owners. Austin Bierce recounts how they avoided those bounty hunters and got people safely out of the city. Another incredible book, which is published by an operative of the Underground Railroad, an African-American free black man named William Still, who functioned in Philadelphia in the 1850s. He publishes a book in 1872 called The Underground Railroad, A Record of Facts, Authentic Letters and Narratives, etc. Now, what Still did during the 1850s, he operated a safe house near the waterfront in Philadelphia on Delhi Street. And he did something that probably wasn't very wise. He kept careful notes of all of the people whom he helped. And if he had been caught with those notes, he would have been liable to prosecution, but he wasn't caught. And so he is able to publish his account years later. And because of that, we know about around 600 people whom he helped over a period of years in the 1850s. One of those accounts is this one, Captain James Watson Fountain, and the schooner called the City of Richmond, which was a packet boat. It ran a regular route up and down the East Coast, stopping at various ports regularly. And he was suspected of helping and putting African Americans on board his ship and taking them out of enslavement. In November of 1855, in Norfolk, Virginia, a delegation of city officials come on board and say, "We're going to search your ship because we think that you're helping people to escape." Captain Fountain feigns indignation and outrage, and he says, "You're suspecting me of doing this. I'm not guilty of this. I'll show you that I don't have people on board my ship." And he grabs an axe and he starts to hack into the deck of his vessel. Well, no captain in his right mind would do that. And so the delegation said, "Okay, we believe you. We'll back away." But in fact, he had 21 people on board his ship who were escaping, and he manages to get them to freedom. The delegation did not find them. This is another illustration from the William Still book. I really like this illustration because it sort of encapsulates so many of the advantages of escaping by water. First of all, whole families could escape. Relatively large numbers of people could escape. And people who couldn't easily travel overland, like children, could escape. It also shows that the operatives of the Underground Railroad are people of color. In fact, you have in Philadelphia a large free black population, many of them actively engaged in the Underground Railroad as operatives, and they are helping to unload people at a out of the way place called League Island near the port of Philadelphia. And they're loading people in the middle of the night into carriages where the windows have been covered up so that prying eyes could not look in and see who was there. This, for me, is just a great illustration of why escaping by water made so much more sense. It was more secure, it was safer, it was faster, it was easier, and this illustration really sort of shows that. Um, I am mindful of the time, so I would like to go through just a few other examples of people who escaped. This is Dempsey Hill, who escapes from Beaufort, North Carolina, right as the Civil War is breaking out. He was himself a waterman, and he knew that in the customs house of Beaufort, there were charts that would be really valuable to the blockading Union warships that were just off the coast. And so he steals them from the customs house, hides them in a cemetery, and then organizes some colleagues to take those charts in a stolen pilot boat out to the waiting Union Navy ships. He's immediately signed on as an able-bodied seaman. The Union Navy recognized his value as a mariner, as a waterman, and he serves throughout the war. After the war, he became a pleasure boat captain here in Massachusetts on Buzzards Bay. And when he dies in 1894, he gets an obituary in the Boston Globe and other local newspapers that celebrated him as a well-loved and much respected captain working in Buzzards Bay. Very unusual for an African American man in the end of the 19th century anywhere. This is a story that you may have heard of. This is the story of Robert Smalls, who worked on a Confederate gunboat in Charleston, South Carolina. The gunboat is called the Planter. It was an armored, it had been a transport vessel, but a steam vessel becomes a gunboat in the Confederate Navy. There were nine African American crew members, all of them enslaved, and three white officers. One evening, the officers went ashore to go to a party, and Smalls, who had been the sort of the pilot of the vessel, what they called a wheelman, because he wasn't allowed to have the title of pilot. That was reserved for white pilots. He plans to take himself, his crew members, and their families to steal the boat that evening on the 13th of May, 1862. He had to navigate out of Charleston Harbor, and he had to provide signals to the fortresses and the gun batteries that guarded Charleston Harbor in time of war. His wife remembered to bring a big white sheet so that when they got out to the blockading Union vessels, they wouldn't be fired upon. He turns this ship over to the Union Navy and then is reassigned to it as a member of the crew. There's a white captain that's assigned to this vessel, but the captain was rather incompetent. So Smalls becomes the first African American man to be the official commander of a Union warship beginning in 1862-63. He survives the war. He becomes a celebrity because of this act of bravery. And after the war, he represents his community as an African American member of Congress during the Reconstruction era in the South. He buys the home of his enslaver, lives in it, and he ends up at the end of his life. He is the customs collector for the city south of South Carolina where he had grown up, south of Charleston. This is a fascinating story. It really ought to be a film, and I have not given you all the detail, but as I understand it, there is a film about his life in the works. So we have this knowledge of people escaping by water. Harper's Weekly during the Civil War was publishing images of people escaping by water. There are lots of examples of this, and it's sort of extraordinary that knowledge of that did not continue into the late 20th century. But this is a map that we had created as we made our book, and all of the places from which people were documented from escaping or where they escaped to is given on this map. And I wanted to point out for you that in New Jersey, we have documentation of Morristown and Newark and some areas around New York City. Cape May was a place to which people escaped. We don't have Trenton there, but I wouldn't be surprised that with a little bit of digging, there would be some local stories that would be relevant to this particular story. You can put our map next to the map that I showed you earlier, and you can see the regions out of which people came. It makes perfect sense given the populations of enslaved people in the antebellum South. I just want to finish with a few slides from our local town here in New Bedford, because New Bedford became known as a destination on the Maritime Underground Railroad. Here's a runaway slave ad from the 1840s from Maryland. The probability is that she has gone towards New Bedford as she has a father living there, a woman named Jane Pennington, about 20 years old. And so it was known throughout the South by word of mouth that if you could get to New Bedford, you would be in a place where you could be safe, you could earn a living. The population there was militantly anti-slavery. And our colleague Catherine Grover wrote a book about 20 years ago called The Fugitives' Gibraltar, which is what it was called. It was known as, New Bedford was known as the Fugitives' Gibraltar, a safe place where enslaved people could escape to. Because New Bedford was, of course, at the time, the capital of the American whaling business, there was always work available on the waterfront of New Bedford. And so people escaping from a maritime environment in the South who had the skills of watermen or ship repairing skills, they could easily find work in New Bedford. And because the whaling business was in the hands of Quakers, the Society of Friends, the Quakers by the late 18th century were strongly anti-slavery. They were abolitionist. And as they owned the whaling industry, or much of it, and controlled it, they were very willing to provide an environment where people who were escaping from enslavement could find work. So the population of New Bedford, by the way, of all the cities in the North, it has the highest percentage of African Americans living in the city of New Bedford prior to the Civil War. There were more people of African descent in Boston or Philadelphia or New York, but as a percentage of the entire population, New Bedford has the highest of any city in the North. There were also people who were predecessors who served as examples to the African American community in New Bedford. Absalom Boston was a Quaker, a Nantucket-born mariner and sea captain, and he sailed with all-black crews on whale ships as early as 1822 and was an abolitionist leader in Nantucket. Another person, even older, Captain Paul Cuffey, who was probably the wealthiest person of color in the United States in the early 19th century. He was an abolitionist, a Quaker, a trader. He owned vessels, including this one here called the Traveler, a brig, which he took into the United Kingdom. He sailed into Bristol and Liverpool in England with an all-black crew and made the newspapers of England, because here he is sailing from a country that was still legally holding slaves, but you have this all-black crew with the U.S. flagged vessel sailing into Britain to trade. He successfully sued the state of Massachusetts for the right to vote as a man of property, and he founds the first racially integrated school in a suburb of a neighboring town of New Bedford called Westport, where he had property. His son was also a ship captain and master of whaling vessels, and he sailed in the 1830s with all-black crews. And this is the roster of his crew of a ship called the Rising States. And if you look at the physical description of all the sailors, you can see that they're all people of color. They're all of African descent. Of course, Frederick Douglass comes to New Bedford in 1838. It is his first home in freedom. He escaped partly by sea and partly by land, but he was carrying a seaman's protection paper that identified him falsely as a free black mariner. But apparently, he had grown up on waterfronts in Maryland. He was a skilled caulker. he could walk the walk and talk the talk, and so he was never challenged. He never actually had to show or prove his identity as a free black man employed in the maritime trades. Where he came in New Bedford is still standing. The house, the White House here on the left, called the Nathan and Polly Johnson home. Nathan and Polly Johnson were people of color. They were abolitionists. They gave assistance to fugitive enslaved people. Their home was right next to the old Quaker meeting house, the 18th century Quaker meeting house, with an entrance for men and an entrance for women. But this home is now a museum. You can visit it. It is the headquarters of the aforementioned New Bedford Historical Society, and they have been very active, this society, in recovering the history of New Bedford as a center of abolitionism and as a stop on and a destination on the Underground Railroad. Right across the street from where we're looking right now, there's a brand new park called Abolition Row Park with a newly inaugurated statue of Douglass that was put up just a year and a half or 2 years ago. And behind it, you can see the new Quaker Meeting House, which was built in 1822 of brick with an entrance for men and entrance for women. So we've done a lot in New Bedford to really recover and to celebrate our history as a place that was important to the Underground Railroad and to the freedom of freedom-seeking enslaved individuals, because they could come here at the peak of the whaling industry and always find work. Two very good examples of the people who did this. One is Lewis Temple, who revolutionized the whaling industry with a harpoon. He was a blacksmith, and he created a toggle head harpoon, which vastly increased the efficiency of catching whales. And we have a statue to him on the grounds of our city hall. He escaped from Richmond, Virginia in 1830, died in New Bedford, and is remembered as someone who vastly improved the efficiency of whaling. Also, William Carney, who escaped from Norfolk, Virginia, and comes to New Bedford. He joins the famed 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry Regiment, and he's the first African American man to earn the Congressional Medal of Honor for feats in battle. And he is buried here in New Bedford. If we look at the art of the whaling industry, we see that African Americans are always depicted. They were very commonly employed in the whaling industry. And of course, there's this guy who's front and center, but I want to draw your attention to the man on the very far left, because you have an officer of a whaleboat who is a man of color. He's called a boat steerer, and he would have been in charge of a crew of mostly white sailors. So the fact that in the whaling industry, a person of color could rise to a position of authority based on merit was a pretty important thing. And again, if we look at the art of the whaling industry, we see these kinds of depictions all the time. And my final slide here is the New Bedford Whaling Museum, which has done a great job in incorporating this story into their collections over the last 20 years or so. We had an exhibition based on the book, Sailing to Freedom, and that was here in May, from May to November 2022. The exhibition has now become a traveling exhibition. It is currently at the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum in the Eastern Shore of Maryland. It will soon be in Philadelphia, beginning in September of this year. And we also have it coming up in Charleston, South Carolina, also in September of this year. So we'll be in multiple locations along the East Coast in important port cities that were important to this story. I am so grateful for your attention. Thank you to everyone. And this is the book. And if you're keen to get the book, you can use this code with UMass Press to get 30% off of the book. So I will stop there, and I'll be happy to answer questions.
I will say on behalf of all of us, thank you very much. And anybody who would like to pose a question, feel free to unmute yourself and put it out there. Or if you'd rather type it in the chat, I will check the chat and see if there's a question that somebody's entered there.
I'd like to ask a question.
Sure.
Hi, Tim. That was phenomenal. So thank you so much. I've been studying the Underground Railroad for, I don't know, at least 10, 15 years, and that was a whole new story. So that was really powerful. And I know you can't go into this, but I just have one question because you mentioned the routes going to, obviously to New Bedford and to Massachusetts and to New Hampshire. But my curiosity is, what about Maine? Have you spent any time and is there more information about the male whale? I mean, the main whale, the roots. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. So people going towards the Canadian Maritimes would probably have gone through Maine. They would have gone down east, up the I'm trying to think of the name of the bay there. It's it has Portuguese. I can't remember the name of the bay, but yes, going towards Lubeck and down East Maine, people would have traveled through there. And in fact, we are trying to mount a new sort of subsidiary research project where we're looking at people crossing over into Canada from coastal Maine, particularly the port of Lubeck.
Hmm.
And so the Bay of Fundy, yeah, people traveling through there to get, yeah. And so the short answer is yes, there were people doing it, but again, with so much of this information, it doesn't leave a paper trail because it was illegal and because it was clandestine. And so you have to tease out the information, often from sometimes unpublished accounts, digging into the local history. So I can't answer you with any examples currently, but I suspect just from what I know about how people traveled from New Bedford and Boston towards Canada, it's likely that there are some touch points along the Maine coast where people found refuge.
Right. I mean, I definitely know just a little bit about Portland. Portland was a way in as well. So, yeah, is there a way to stay in touch with you as you unfold that piece or can talk?
Sure, yeah. So I'm on the history faculty at the University of Massachusetts Dartmouth. My email is really easy to find. You can just Google me at UMass, and twalker@umassd.edu is my email. So yeah, I'd be very happy to receive questions or further comments. I don't have much to tell you right now, but I'm hoping that in years coming, um, there are a couple of other when you do a project like this, what you want to see is it spin off into other historians doing additional work. And I think that there are two books that ought to be written about this subject. One of them focusing on the Gulf of Mexico and people going south to the Caribbean and to Mexico, because in both instances there were Caribbean islands and Mexico itself where slavery was illegal by the 1830s. We only focused on the East Coast. And so there's another book to be written about the Gulf of Mexico and about the Caribbean, but there's also a book to be written about the inland waterways, the Ohio River, the Mississippi River, the Great Lakes, and the canal systems that were also conduits of escape. And so I've started a project to try to look at that, which I'm trying to get off the ground this year, that will be a kind of follow-up project where we look at inland waterways, particularly in the upper Midwest.
Thank you.
Sure.
Something to look forward to. And you anticipated a question I had, which
Hmm.
was, as you just mentioned, you focused on the Eastern Seaboard. And I was wondering about Louisiana and Alabama and Mississippi and so on. But apparently, that there were escapes by water from those states.
Yes. Yeah.
Great.
We were aware of people escaping towards the Caribbean and the Bahamas from Florida. Um, there was recently a book out about people fleeing to Mexico over land.
Mhm.
Karen Baumgartner, I think is the name of the author. Very well received book, but she didn't deal or do research on people escaping by water in the Gulf of Mexico. I have to think, given the level of trade between ports in the U.S. and ports in Mexico, between Texas and Mexico, there must have been escapes by water. And people knew that that Mexico was, by the 1830s, a free territory. So yeah, it has to be. I can't imagine that it wouldn't be happening. I just can't document it right now.
So this would be we'll keep you in mind. We'll keep in touch. So if you write those books, one of those books, the Inland Waterways, the Gulf of Mexico, and so on, that we'll be able to hear more of your fascinating stories.
Thank
Does
you.
anyone else have a comment or question?
See if there's anything in the chat here.
Yeah, let's look. I see some compliments. Outstanding, fascinating discussion from people in Pittsfield, Massachusetts.
Oh, great.
Um,
Go ahead.
we have recorded this talk and it'll be on our website. So people who have listened to this talk and think others might be interested, in several weeks, there would probably be on our website, which is williamtrenthouse.org, on our videos and recordings page. I hope to have Dr. Walker's talk up there, and you can refer people to that. Thank
And
you very, very much. Go ahead.
for my part, I want to say that the William Trent House is now on my list of places that I really want to visit.
Yes.
And so I hope to make it down there one day and hopefully get a chance to see you all in person. So thank you so much for your interest and for giving me an opportunity to share this story with you.
Thank you, and thank everyone for joining us. Keep us in mind for future programs. Dr. Walker, you'll be hearing from me soon.
Very good. Thank you. All the
Thanks.
best.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.